I want to pose the question before we get into the lesson. Like literature, if you don't know, literature is the word we use to describe fictional writing, imaginative writing. And there are different forms of literature. The novel is the most widely recognized form of literature, right? So we'll look at the different forms of literature. And I wanted to pose the question for you guys to think about as we go through this lesson. What are the benefits of reading? Like, how many books in a year do you read? What kinds of books do you enjoy reading? And can you think of a book in particular that had a significant impact on you? Really changed you in some way, benefited your life in some way? I'm asking you guys to consider the question, what are the benefits of reading fiction? Some regard reading fiction as a form of entertainment, as a way of passing the time, falling asleep at the end of the day. Have you ever really seriously fallen in love with a book where you just couldn't put it down? It was so captivating. What are the benefits of reading is what I want to ask you guys to think about as we go through this lesson. So the topic of the evening is Introduction to Literature. And this is the this is the worksheet that I sent to the study group. So shown here are 24 vocabulary terms and a little diagram at the bottom showing what the elements of a story are. We'll get into that in just a moment. I want to show you what you can expect in this lesson, what's coming up. Okay, in this lesson we will define literature, literary forms, and other key vocabulary. For those of you that are here tonight, I strongly suspect that you're already familiar with the meaning of the term literature. Genres of fiction. Explore genres of fiction. So we will be looking at the different popular genres of fiction, what they are, and what are some well-known titles. After that, we will look at outlining and defining the elements of fictional stories. As we can kind of see in this work, in this work page here, this worksheet, I should say, the diagram at the bottom shows us sort of a visual map of the elements of a story. So in defining key vocabulary, giving you the language to critique and discuss the parts of a story, critique how well a story is written, and at the end we'll watch a video that talks a little bit about what are some of the benefits of reading fiction. Okay, so that's all we're doing tonight. It's an introductory lesson. There's a lot to really dive into, but we won't have enough time to do that tonight. But we'll be coming back to it. So we're starting from scratch, and we're really just looking at a few simple topics. What are the literary genres? What are the fictional genres? The types of genres that you'll find in the bookstore. And a lot of these fictional stories follow a type of similar outline, a similar template. The elements of fictional stories, as we can see in this diagram here. Okay, so starting with the vocabulary. Download the vocabulary, download the worksheet, translate the words. I'll define them for you now. First of all, the antagonist. By the way, I hope the internet is working well tonight. I hope we're not having connection problems. We had a really bad storm yesterday, and that knocked out my Wi-Fi. So I won't know until after this lesson whether or not the connection is any good. We're working off of my 4G connection for my cell phone. So I hope the internet's okay tonight. I hope you can follow along with what I'm saying. I'm going back to the worksheet here. An antagonist. You have the antagonist and you have the protagonist. In the worksheet, if you already downloaded it, you maybe have already seen in the elements of the story, characters, antagonists and protagonists. This is the way we talk about the good characters and the bad characters, or the heroes and the villains. To antagonize is to cause somebody suffering. To antagonize. To be antagonistic is to be a bit of a troublemaker, intentionally causing other people annoyance. So the antagonist is somebody who means to do harm to the main character. It's the villain. Chapter. Novels are divided into chapters. Character. This is the who. These are the people or other types of beings that we read about in fictional stories. The climax. So I would draw your attention to the diagram below, and going from left to right, you have the characters, and then go up, you have the plot. The plot begins with the exposition and then rising action, and it reaches a peak. The climax is where sort of the peak moment of excitement that takes place in the story, or at the end of a film usually. We've all seen an action film with the great climactic battle at the end. That's the climax. That's basically where the story reaches its peak moment of tension, where it looks like the protagonist, the main hero, may not win the war. That's the climax there. A comedy. Comedy is an amusing, humorous story. Conflict. A battle, a war, where characters are at opposing agendas, basically. A drama. It's one of the literary forms. We have the novel or prose. We have poetry, and then we have drama. A drama is a play. Exposition. Exposition is a literary device. It's a technique that writers use to carry the plot forward without having to show the audience every single thing, right? A lot happens in a story. Sometimes there's a jump from, like a story can take place over several days or over many years, let's say, right? So when you have a time jump, there will have to be some exposition where the narrator or the characters are telling the reader through dialogue or through narration what took place that wasn't really shown to the reader or audience, basically. Readers like to be shown, they like to kind of experience for themselves the events in the plot. But exposition is a way of, quickly going over some of the background information that is, the reader needs to know to be able to piece together the puzzle pieces of the plot. Fiction. You have fiction and nonfiction. Journalism and essays and reference materials are nonfiction. A dictionary, an encyclopedia, a newspaper is nonfiction. A magazine is nonfiction. And stories are fiction. The genre is the category of fiction that has its different settings, its different themes. Think of a science fiction and a romance, I guess, right? It's a very different type of a tone, a mood, an atmosphere, a set of expectations. When you read these, you expect to be excited when you read a science fiction, and you expect different kind of emotion from a romance or a horror, let's say, right? We read and we read stories and we watch films to experience new emotions. And so we have our favorite genres because we, prefer different types of emotions. Irony and humor. I'll have more to say on this. I would have a lot more to say on this topic when we actually look at literary devices in greater detail. But for the sake of tonight, irony simply means we laugh. We find things amusing that are unexpected. And that's what irony is. When we are joking, basically. Like a joke is where we are speaking in figurative ways. Rather than speaking literally, speaking what is true and real and factual, we make up some funny story. Or we say something unexpected. We kind of betray our true feelings to surprise our audiences. That's what irony is, the unexpected surprise that makes us laugh. Literature. Literature is imaginative fictional writing, and it can be the novel, it can be poetry, or it can be drama. A metaphor, again, it's a literary device like irony, and I don't have much to say on that tonight. Again, we'll cover that more when we look at literary devices in a future lesson. But a metaphor is where a comparison between an event taking place is made to some other kind of abstract concept, like a symbol or something like that. A metaphor is where we compare we compare someone or something or some event to something imaginary. A moral. A moral is a lesson. Like, again, I asked you to consider the question, what are the benefits of reading great works of fiction? And one of those benefits is you can be told what is moral, you can be told what is right and wrong, but a story that shows how a character comes to learn that through life experience is much more memorable and much more impactful, let's say. The lesson hits us in a deeper way. So a moral, like the purpose of telling stories, is to excite and amuse and entertain and sometimes strike a little bit of fear, to make us imagine and wonder and speculate, and to learn, like to model our character after characters that we read about. And so the great writers, especially those that have sort of become like immortalized, and the most popular writers in history are so popular, are so important because the morals that they present in their books have actually been so influential as to like almost shape, influence the culture. Okay, a narrative or a narrator. A character is an actor in a story, a person in a story, and the narrator. You could say that the main character is oftentimes the narrator, the storyteller. So narrative is storytelling. Narrator is the storyteller. Plot. So plot is the events, the outline of events that take place in a story. Poetry is a form of literature where it's not really storytelling. There may be storytelling in it, but it doesn't necessarily have to be storytelling. It's more wordplay. Shakespeare was, one of the greatest poets who ever lived. There are a few others that come to mind. And they write within a structure of verse that has a number of beats in it, let's say. So music has a measure and rhythm, and poetry could be set to music. Poetry and songwriting lyrics are one and the same, I would say. Prose, on the other hand, is what you read in a novel, in a short story. It can be poetic, but it's not following the structure of poetry. The protagonist, the antagonist is the villain, the protagonist is the main character and the hero. Resolution, that's when the story is said and done, when the story is finished. When the story is finished, it comes to its resolution, where the characters live happily ever after. Satire, like irony. Satire is a form of writing where, or a way of speaking. To be satirical and to be ironic is to try to be humorous. Satire is a little bit more critical, a little bit more ridiculing and insulting, or at least critical. Tension is the feeling of discomfort caused by the fear of loss, or when the main character is feeling challenged by the situation. Theme. Genres deal with different themes. So the adventure, science fiction, or fantasy deals with the theme of courage and heroism, whereas drama and romance and possibly horror kind of deal more with the inner emotional states, the strong emotional states of being. These are themes. And finally, tragedy. Well, tragedy is a kind of a story that has a negative ending, basically. So let's continue here. Looking at literary forms. What is literature? What is the definition of literature? Literature can mean any form of written work. For example, news journalism, an academic or personal essay, poetry, any form of written work is considered to be literature. Literature is more popularly defined as imaginative fictional writing and serious writing as well. Like you can have, stories that don't have a whole lot of depth to them, and then you have stories that have maybe less plot and less excitement, but a lot more depth. These are considered to be works of literature. Prose is the story in the form of novel and novella, whereas poetry follows structural rules, verse and rhyme. Drama is the script or play. For example, Shakespearean plays can be viewed in the theater, performed by actors, or read and studied from books. Tragedy and comedy. Literary works, especially dramas, can be broadly categorized into two forms: tragedies and comedies. Tragicomedies are those that blend both together. What is known to modern audiences today as dark comedies. So comedy is intended to be lighthearted. You can have these kind of serious, dark stories where some tragic things actually do happen to characters, like a character dies or something. But there's still funny things that take place in it. That's a tragic comedy, basically. A tragedy, there's very little humor. The tone needs to be very serious. Maybe there's some comic relief in it occasionally, but ultimately the tone is quite dark, quite sad, quite shocking. Tragedies are those that deal with tragic, unfortunate events, especially concerning the downfall or the demise or the destruction of the main character or protagonist. As audiences, we feel some emotional attachment to the characters. We really do feel empathy and we want them to succeed. Even though it's fictional, we feel like an affinity with them, and it's quite upsetting when the ending is when the ending does not go well for the protagonist. A comedy, on the other hand, a comedy by contrast, is intended to be humorous, amusing, and satirical. Characters are beset with challenges and adversities, but the story ends positively for the protagonist. So the definition here is satire. A fool, a clown, a trickster, or a character that is childish or a little naive, I think, makes the perfect protagonist in a comedy, because they have to make all of these mistakes, and maybe the world and other characters sort of take advantage of the main character, and the main character finds themselves in all these amusing situations because of their stupidity, let's say. That is the author using satire to point out these types of flaws that people have, basically. So, the original purpose of drama was to give expression to religion came after drama. Like you had people worshiping nature, worshiping a pantheon of gods, let's say, the god of the sky, the god of the mountains, and these were the way that these early dramatists, these early writers, would personify, let's say, their gods, was through these stories, to give people some sense of how to identify with these gods, these deities that they were worshiping. That's myth and legend, but that evolved into stories concerning society, right? And again, it was a way to sort of instruct and teach morals, good behavior, how to deal with, the purpose of art. Art gives a voice to the things that are not easily spoken about, basically. That's what art is for. That's why we have all of these great works of art. Broadly categorized into comedies and and tragedies. Myths, fables, and fairy tales. So a myth is a traditional story concerning the history of a people, typically involving the supernatural. So a myth is a story passed on orally over generations, talking about the history of a people, how the tribe, how the nation, I suppose, was established, founded through some great heroic battle of the ancestors, the great heroes of antiquity. A fable, like a fairy tale, is a short story involving animals as characters. Fable is a very short story, whereas a fairy tale is a child's story. It's not quite a fable. It has more complexity to it. But it's, fables and fairy tales are really intended for children. The stories are short and the plot is simple. And the characters are very kind of straightforward, not a whole lot of complexity to them. Another form of literature is graphic novels, where instead of using just text, you're also using illustrations. Comic strips, illustrated stories, these are quite popular. And they typically feature the adventures of superheroes aimed at teenagers and young adult audiences. So now we'll look at the literary genres. This is J.R. Tolkien's Hobbit. Fantasy adventure. A little bit like a fairy tale. But now it is in the novel format. So it's long form. Fairy tale is really just, it's quite short. A fantasy can be a serialized epic, taking place over several books with hundreds of characters. It's a speculative fiction set in a fictional universe. So fantasy is quite popular in film and in literature because characters are important, but what is equally, if not more interesting, is the universe, the world in which they live. Stories predominantly take place in a medieval setting, a historical drama with elements of the supernatural, the magic. The natural laws of the real world can be broken by superhuman or non-human characters who possess special abilities. Magic. The supernatural. A supernatural being like this dragon. Themes and inspiration are taken from ancient folklore, myth, and legend. So a dragon is a mythical or legendary creature, just like the phoenix and angels and fairies. These are types of supernatural beings commonly present in fantasy stories that have been talked about in ancient myth, going back thousands of years. So the great authors in the fantasy genre that I would invite you to check out for yourself: J.K. Rowling, Harry Potter; J.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings; George R. Martin, The Game of Thrones; and Lewis Carroll, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Harry Potter, George Martin for mature audiences, and Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Science fiction. Speculative fiction that deals with futuristic concepts, such as natural science, technology, space exploration, time travel, and alien extraterrestrial life. Fantasy and science fiction often overlap. I think of Star Wars by George Lucas as a great science fiction fantasy. It's science fiction because it's set in space with lots of alien characters, but it's very much a fantasy because it deals with forces unexplained by science. The Force, these magical sorcerers, basically, the Jedi and the Sith. So the original Star Wars trilogy is a great example of a science fiction fantasy, and Lord of the Rings is a purely fantasy. The Avengers and the Marvel Cinematic Universe is mostly science fiction. Thor and Ragnarok, that story is more fantasy, but most of the, so you have an overlap between fantasy and science fiction. I would say that the Marvel series is much more of a science fiction, and the Star Wars trilogy is a science fiction. The Game of Thrones and the Lord of the Rings, because it's set in the medieval era, that's purely fantasy. These others are set more in the future, and they take place in outer space. Those are science fiction. Fantasy and science fiction often overlap due to their speculative nature. In other words, readers enjoy the kind of new universe, the new world imagined by an author, involving fictional settings and alien characters. Hard science fiction, on the other hand, tries to apply limits to the fantastical and enforce realism by adhering to known scientific principles. So authors like Isaac Asimov and H.G. Wells, Ray Bradbury, I think, these are strictly science fiction writers in that they have a great interest in understanding the scientific concepts and setting the story around these scientific concepts without stretching the limits of reality, basically. Yeah. The great authors in the work of science fiction: Jules Verne, H.G. Wells, Isaac Asimov, and Michael Crichton. This is Jules Verne, one of the first science fiction writers. He wrote 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and Journey to the Center of the Earth. If you can find these classic 1960s Disney movies, I highly, highly recommend them. They're fantastic. They've really stood the test of time. Even though it's, these stories were written, I think, in the 1920s, where Jules Verne didn't, the author didn't have any clear ideas to what the future should look like. So it's I guess it's amusing for modern day audiences and readers to read something like Jules Verne and Ray Bradbury and H.G. Wells, because these were written back in the 1950s, 40s, and 1920s and 30s. But it deals with science fiction and the storytelling and the quality of the writing. These are works of literature, basically. H.G. Wells. We'll get to horror in just a second, but this is a science fiction horror. Quite a tragic story, basically, where a race of alien invaders destroy Earth, right? This is the first Armageddon or apocalyptic science fiction book written, I believe. Isaac Asimov, I, Robot, and Jurassic Park by Michael Crichton. Hopefully you've seen the original Jurassic Park. This was a big hit when it originally came out, because this is right about the time when mainstream society was beginning to understand the genetic science, the science of genetics, and how scientists were uncovering the mysteries of the genome, the DNA, and were able to create cloned animals. So here we have Michael Crichton and Jurassic Park, where the DNA taken from fossilized samples of dinosaurs were brought back to life in the modern day. You have to see this film, and I would recommend that you read the book. Moving on to horror. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. Speculative fiction, so fantasy and science fiction and horror are all the speculative fiction genres, where they kind of imagine the supernatural or the universe and the world that we don't live in. Speculative fiction is intended to shock and frighten and stir feelings of horror and terror in the reader. You could say that the Game of Thrones is a fantasy horror because it's quite terrifying, much of it. And H.G. Wells is a science fiction horror. War of the Worlds is a science fiction horror. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is a science fiction horror. Bram Stoker's Dracula is a fantasy horror. So all three of these genres are very much like they overlap, let's say. And they just they deal with different themes. Now, the main character in the horror genre is oftentimes the antagonist. The story may be told like the narrator may be the protagonist in the story, but the main character is the antagonist in the horror genre. Antagonists in the horror genre are more important, basically. The villains, and they may be supernatural, for example, a creature possessing superhuman strength or magic, like a ghost or a monster. Hopefully you are familiar with the story of Frankenstein. Frankenstein is a zombie, basically. A man who is brought back from the dead. I guess that makes it a science fiction. Yeah, it's a science fiction horror. A scientist uses, scientific innovation to bring somebody back from the dead. So we'll have to look at this story sometime. If you haven't had a chance to actually read some authentic representation of them. It's a long novel, but there are condensed versions of it. But the character of Frankenstein is one who is not evil, but is an antagonist, is a villain, does terrible things. You could say that the new Joker that's out is about a character who isn't inherently evil, but does evil things. So horror deals with some very interesting themes of what motivations, the villain is also the victim, let's say. A lot of horror does not involve the supernatural, however. The antagonist may simply be psychologically disturbed, or an evil human. So there are those characters that are purely evil, and then there are those characters that do evil things, but they do it out of kind of suffering. So subgenres exist within horror that distinguish their themes: psychological thrillers and science fiction or fantasy horrors. Frankenstein is a psychological thriller and a fantasy horror. And then we have these other ones here. Bram Stoker's Dracula. Edgar Allan Poe wrote short stories like The Raven and the Telltale Heart. Stephen King wrote, I think, like hundreds of books, and many of them were turned into very successful movies and TV shows, such as The Shining, It, Anne Rice, also a popular film series, Interview with the Vampire. So this is Dracula. A vampire is a monster. And Edgar Allan Poe. These are great for. Uh, I would recommend reading Edgar Allan Poe because the stories are short, the language is quite simple. A teenager can read this, and it's eerie, it's unsettling, it's a little disturbing. It kind of creates a feeling of discomfort, but it's not quite shocking, and it doesn't contain like graphic gore and violence. So when we think of the horror film genre, we might think of something like The Walking Dead and all of these terrible gore movies where audiences are simply shocked by the sight of graphic depictions of violence. In literature, it's really more about the character and and the way that the narrator can get the reader to imagine the setting or the feeling that the character is feeling. So Edgar Allan Poe was a writer that really played with using language to create feelings of mystery and dread, let's say, dread. Fear of the natural world, or the supernatural. Okay, Stephen King. Uh, see The Shining if you can to get your first taste of what Stephen King is all about. It's a psychological drama, a psychological thriller, a suspense thriller about a character who goes mad, right? He's driven insane by isolation and alienation. He starts imagining ghosts. That's all I'll say about that. You must see it for yourself. And many hundreds of books and dozens of successful movies, TV shows. Stephen King. This is historical fiction. So these are dramas. In other words, another way of using the word drama is dealing with just the interactions and the stories of everyday, ordinary people. A lot of literature, especially classic literature, that isn't speculative fiction. We've been looking at the speculative fiction genres, horror, science fiction, and fantasy. Drama and literature is hardly speculative. It's just dealing with characters. It's a melodrama. When you watch a TV show about characters, there's probably some romance happening in there. A little bit of adventure, but it's very much rooted in reality. That's a drama. And more of the focus, more of the theme is on character development and how a character comes to reach a new stage of maturity or understanding of himself or herself and other characters, right? And then there's historical drama, historical fiction, which is a drama that takes place in a historical setting. So it is actually, this genre is a speculative genre because readers are taken back into history. The medieval period, the Western frontier, Wild West, United States period, the Victorian era, speculative in nature, similar to the fantasy genre, except that the characters and settings are rooted in real historical times and places, and there's no supernatural. Historical fiction allows readers to enjoy imagining the lives of those who lived in past eras and learning about the historical world through fiction. Okay, moving on to crime and mystery. Mystery fiction is the genre that involves a crime, such as the murder or other criminal event that needs to be solved. So, mystery fiction. The central character is often a police detective or private investigator. Other characters in the story are connected to the crime, for example, friends and families to the victim, witnesses and suspects, those who have credible motives. So we have Arthur Conan Doyle and The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Agatha Christie was a really prolific mystery writer. Okay. Murder on the Orient Express was a popular film that came out a couple of years ago, written by Agatha Christie. The spy and the thriller, the spy or the war thriller. Spy and war thrillers are those exciting adventures, oftentimes involving elements of mystery and sometimes science fiction. The James Bond series, I'm sure you've seen Skyfall, Casino Royale. The aim of the spy novel is to excite readers. Spectre. The main protagonist is oftentimes an agent of the government, a spy or a soldier with exceptional abilities to hunt down enemies and escape dangerous situations. It's a spy thriller, popular genre of fiction. The plot centers around the protagonist's journey to uncover and prevent the villain from carrying out their catastrophic plans against the nation or world. Here we have James Bond, written by Ian Fleming. Robert Ludlum and the Bourne Identity. John le Carre and Tom Clancy. These were prolific writers in the spy thriller genre, and all of these were turned into films as well. Romance. Jane Austen. The focus of the storytelling in a romance novel or story is centered on the relationship and romantic love between two people. The romance can be set in any variety of other genre. So a fantasy, a science fiction, a mystery, and so on. Romances often involve various subplots to add interest by adding tension and conflict. Romances are mostly comedies and dramas. Romances often resolve by having the main protagonists overcome their challenges or perform some kind of sacrifice so that they may be together. For example, protective parents, character flaws, jealousy and betrayal on the part of other characters towards the main protagonist, and other types of accidents or setbacks. Now, in Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, this is one of the few examples of a tragic romance. I can't think of too many other examples of tragic romances. Certainly none better than Romeo and Juliet, a tragic romance, where the characters accidentally sacrifice their lives in a failed attempt to fake their deaths to escape from their families. Have you read or seen a dramatization of Romeo and Juliet? You really must. And then we have Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, and Stephenie Meyer's Twilight is one of the leading best-selling romances of today. Kind of a fantasy horror. It's not really a horror. It involves monsters, but it's very much fantastical. There's not an element of fear in it, really, and it's a romance. So it's a fantasy romance, basically. Lots of romances are fantasy romances. I promised that we would look at some of these literary techniques or literary devices, the elements of a story, how to critique and how to understand, the evolution, the development of a story. When you want to review a story, like you want to recommend a story to a friend or something like that, a book that you read or a film that you saw, you can use these elements to structure your critique or your summary of a story. Okay, so the elements of the story, you have the characters, the protagonist, the hero, and the antagonist, the villain. You have the setting, where and when the story is taking place. You have the plot, the sequence of events, starting from the beginning, and then rising action, rising tension, where the challenges and adversarial situations are increasing to the point of climax, and then it resolves after. Down below you see the conflict, and these are other kinds of themes. Man versus himself, like some of the suspense dramas. One that comes to mind is I think his name is Jack Palahniuk or John Palahniuk's Fight Club, and all of these other stories that he wrote. The Stephen King's Shining is another one dealing with the insanity, man versus himself, basically. Dostoevsky, the Russian writer, talked a lot about, and George Orwell actually. George Orwell also had a lot to say about the inner conflict, the conflict that a character has to deal with within himself, and external conflicts. Good guy versus bad guy, hero versus villain, man versus society, man versus nature. There's a film that came out a few years ago with Leonardo DiCaprio called The Revenant. It's a man versus man versus nature type of a story, where a story of survival. There's a few films out there about the people who tried to climb Mount Everest as well. That's a man versus nature type of a story. Man versus technology, science fiction, The Terminator. The themes, okay? The conflict and the theme. Characters. Okay, so these are just definitions of the elements of story or literary devices, and I'll have more to say on these when we come back to literature again in the future. Plot. So the simple definition of plot is the course of events taking place in the story, from beginning, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, act 1, act 2, act 3. Setting. The time and place where and when the story unfolds. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away, once upon a time. The narrator, the character in the story who recounts the events. So there's all the characters in the story, and then there's maybe that onlooking character, and their identity is never really disclosed, or it's some omniscient character, like it's not a character, it's just the writer. And then there's the main character telling the story from his or her own perspective. The protagonist is the leading character, the hero. The antagonist is the villain. Rising action. So the story is set where the characters are introduced and the setting is sort of described and the reader is introduced to the world. And this is called stasis or exposition, where the reader is given the necessary information to know who's who and where and when the story is taking place. And there is a premise or a kind of a source of attention. So, a tyrannical villain is going to threaten the livelihoods of the people living in Middle Earth, let's say. I'm using the Lord of the Rings as the, hopefully you've seen the Lord of the Rings as the example here, right? So the premise is the source of the tension, where there is an evil, tyrannical villain far, far away, and it is he or it is amassing a kind of an army to conquer the rest of Middle Earth. Okay, and then you have these unexpected characters, and the main character you would not expect them to be a great hero. That's kind of what makes the story interesting. Um, in a lot of these adventure stories, actually, the hero is not all powerful. The hero has to go through stages of growth in order to discover their strength and their greatness. Okay, so the trigger is the shocking event that causes the protagonist to make a decision to take him or her on his or her quest. The quest, a long and difficult search for something. Character's quest is often overcoming struggle and adversity to discover his or her inner strength. The reluctant hero, the hero who doesn't want to be the hero, but is put, through circumstance into the situation where they have no other choice other than to rise to greatness, is a very, very popular theme in a lot of great stories. Tension and rising action. This is how we describe how the stakes continue to increase. Mental and emotional discomfort caused by unfortunate events happening to protagonist characters. I have to say that the G.R. Martin Game of Thrones, G.R. Martin is kind of a master of tension, because characters that readers and audiences come to love face real danger, and lots of them die, right? So the reader and the audience feels a real sense of danger and fear for the lives of the characters because they're not invincible, right? A story like the modern day Star Wars, the J.J. Abrams sequel trilogy, was a colossal failure because audiences didn't care about any of the characters. They didn't develop, and they were invincible. They just had all of these magical powers bestowed upon them, and they were never really in any kind of danger. So it was a boring film to watch, one that I didn't watch, but one that I followed. And, it's terrible storytelling because the characters, we don't really care about them. We care about characters that we relate to, okay? And we really enjoy when a character develops or grows. And that's what rising action and tension is intended to do. It's to increase the reader and audience's attachment, investment, and affinity for the character. The conflict, the struggle. The climax is that intense moment when the struggle has reached its peak. It's about to be, the conflict is about to be won, and then you have the resolution, how the story returns to stasis and equilibrium, where everything is well again. The hero can return to his or her normal life. Okay? The theme, the central idea, the moral. We can really remember a story and think back on the characters and the things that happen to the characters. These are the benefits of reading. They can instill in us memories. Like, we might have uninteresting lives tied to our responsibilities with family and work, but a great work of fiction can take us to another time in history, past or future, or another place in the world, and we can just experience the lives of other types of people. And when we engage in this kind of reading regularly, we take in all of these extra experiences that we wouldn't get from our everyday lives. And popular culture media, television, and film, there are a few exceptional films, but most of them really don't try to provoke deep thinking, because they're involved in making money and pleasing audiences and giving people an exciting experience, right? So we can watch a lot of movies and enjoy them, but not really think about them or remember anything, or feel any kind of personal attachment to the story. We just enjoyed it for what it was. But when we read a great work of fiction, you'll know what I'm talking about if you've experienced it for yourself. Something about the story changes your life. It sets you in a new direction, basically. You become a different person. You transform, okay? That's what a moral is. You learn a lesson, basically, through experience. The theme, the recurring idea in the work of literature, for example, characters encountering problems that compel them to learn a lesson in virtue. For example, honor, courage, tragedy and loss, failure and gaining wisdom, and so on. The central idea connected to the premise, the source of conflict or tension. And looking at the Lord of the Rings, the central idea is how power, the corrupting influence of power. This ring, the person who wears this ring, gradually gains more and more magical power, and the tyrannical villain. The ring was stolen from him or it, whatever it is. Sauron, right? I'm not sure if it's a real person or what it is. It's more like Satan. It's the devil, right? So Sauron is the devil. Sauron had something stolen from him, this ring, and this ring is the most powerful thing in Middle Earth. But it's kind of innocuous, right? The first time you wear it, nothing really happens. But the longer and more often you wear this ring, the more power, the more dark power you get. And so many people have tried to be the protector of this ring, but they become like victim of temptation to use the ring, oftentimes for good. But the ring has a inescapable corrupting influence on the person who wears it. So this is the central idea, the corrupting influence of power, and that none are